So what's your biggest self-development stuff? What have you been through? Like who have you looked up to? What have you dove in deep into?
Yeah, so I've been looking up a lot to Joseph McClendon. It used to be Tony Robbins, but I realized who Joseph McClendon was by watching Tony Robbins, and hard to find somebody who's like about self-development that looks like me. There aren't a lot of people out there. So it was somebody to look up to and be able to be like, all right, cool. And so what I've kind of really focused on is I started my first company when I was in high school and I sold it, my senior year of high school. And then I've really just been on the self-motivated, self-income producing, just self-driven. I haven't worked for anybody else since I was in the military. And so for me, it's really a lot of just focusing on, here's what you want. Now get out of your own goddamn way and go get it. So moving past those barriers of, oh, I can't do this because I don't have a degree. It's like, yeah, I mean, I dropped out of college. I don't have a degree and I've been able to turn my life into exactly what I've wanted it to be. That's purely just because I knew what was real. I knew what wasn't real. I knew what could be done in a day and I went and did it.
So we kind of already started the podcast. Are you recording this part, buddy, or we just lost that good stuff?
It says recording at the
It's
corner.
recorded, man. Good.
All right, good.
Well, we do like cameras, so like there's the Zoom recording, then we use cameras and stuff too. So yeah. So when I'm drinking my iced tea that looks like a 40, that the camera's on you instead of me. So
Don't
I
worry
guess
about
it wouldn't be that bad, but
It's the iced tea that's served in a 40 can. That's how you know.
right. So how long were you in the military, bro?
I was only in the military for a short time, literally like I think 2.5 years. Really wasn't one cut out for it. Two, I started making a lot more money and was able to kind of, I'm just say just leave, but basically they have this requirement in the military where if you make over a certain amount of money, you can buy yourself out of your contract. So I got to a point where I was renting at least 25 homes to the people in my own squadron at my own
Mhm.
base. And I realized very quickly that, the total worth of all those homes together was quite a bit. So I went to my command and I was like, listen, I don't need to be here anymore. And they were like, oh, okay, fantastic. It wasn't that easy, but we started the process to get me exited out from there. And that's what I really focused on was like, well, I mean, if these guys have to live the same way, then there are other people that got to live the same way. And I don't think people like living that way. So let me go see what I can do to go make it happen.
And so you're even today, your life is about military communities, about military um families, military investments, right? Into those kind of communities. So tell me about that.
Yeah, so it kind of started off that way. It's kind of grown a little bit more to what I like to call more of an economic development concept, where if you look at a military base, right, a lot of people are like, why do we spend so much money on the military? Well, if people who understand that sentence can deduct that and say how much we spend on the military, it's about $23 trillion a year, sometimes more, right? And that's not even on just our own military, but other militaries. Well, the way a military base function is people get stationed someplace that is generally god awful. People don't like being there because it's in the middle of nowhere, far away from everything, and it's secluded, as a military base should be for strategic purposes, right? With that being the case, these people now have to live there. There has to be a group of people that can cater to these people's needs, which are food, water, electricity, right? There has to be this community built around this military base. All that to say that money, that trillions of dollars, gets broken down into, we'll call it $1.6 billion per military base of GDP output into those communities. And a lot of people don't capture that. So I go and I buy homes that are $35,000. I fix them up and then I place military members in them, but I will fix up an entire neighborhood of homes. That way, for my investors, there's value in the housing price as it goes up. Same thing with the rental market, right? I'm basically creating comps over a steady period of time. And then I create the areas that make it fun to live there, right? The reason people like living in New York, San Francisco, because everything is right there and it's convenient. I'm not going to create a New York or San Francisco, but what I am going to create is a sandwich shop, the strip club, the bar, the whatever they need to put there. I'm going to put it right where I built all those new homes. Now these military members are spending their hard-earned money there for their groceries, for their gas, for everything that they need to sustain their community. That money then goes into the actual community with the civilians who have to live there, who aren't military. They can now afford better housing and they rent that rehabbed housing from me. So I focus on sustaining community growth because that's where the real money is kind of made with what we do is, hey, listen, like I'm helping these people gain equity in their communities and develop and grow while also giving the military members something to do on the weekends and have a good time. And we basically just recycle that cash through that exact same economy. Instead of it going from one place and going far out, it stays here and grows from here.
So how'd you get started? Like, when was the beginning? Like, so sold your first business when you were in high school, right? And then you got out of high school, you went into the military, right? And then you wanted to get out of the military because now you suddenly owned a bunch of homes. So where was that bridge?
The bridge for me was, I think, like day 3 of basic training. They sit you in this room and you go through your classes, right? And all these classes are here's what the military offers you, here's what it pays for. And I'm like, wow, the military pays for all that, huh? And I start thinking to myself, okay, well, if the military is going to pay for that, what I started doing was I had this journal that I wrote all these different businesses in. And I have that journal sitting on my bookshelf, but it's got like 150 different businesses in there. And I was able to deduct, well, all these businesses rely on one thing and one thing only, real estate. And I was like, okay, well, how do I create the area that these people want to really be in? How do I bring these businesses here? Because that was the big challenge for me, was like, in these markets, the commercial properties looked like complete garbage. The roofs were caved in. It was going to cost a lot of money to fix them up. So I had to build capital. I had to be able to make sure I could like get a loan to do this if I needed to get a loan. So I was like, okay, well, I'll start with one house. Bought one house and rented it out. And it was like, wow, I'm making really good money off this one house. And I was able to partner with a few different investors to say, hey, listen, here's what we can make happen if we do X and Y, right? If we go and buy 38 of these homes and 48 of those apartment complexes, we can get to, a standard rate of return of 25% a month or something like that. And that's what we built. And I had to go and pitch it. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all. It was terrible. But once I got it and kind of became like the expert in military housing and tertiary markets, it became a lot simpler.
Man, it's a lot of interesting little things there as you go through each piece of it, right? I look at our students, I look at people that, are trying to get into real estate, right? And each one of those, they can be closed doors and there can be boxes that they run into that they don't understand how to get out of. And so I know you dive deep into personal development and stuff, right? And for me, one of my, friends one time, they were talking about boxes, right? And they says for some people there's a box, some people they think out of the box, and for you, you just kind of like blow up the box and you just do whatever needs to be done, right? And I love that. I felt like that was a great affirmation. Like I kind of own that, going forward over the years and different things. But I can see you, like for each of those things that you're talking about, I see like a domino effect, where in each one's a door, right? And each time you open a door, it knocks down the next domino and the next domino and the next domino. But each one of those could be a door that gets locked. Each one of those could be a door that gets stuck,
Yeah.
And talk about that, that mindset a little bit. I mean, sometimes when you're young and dumb and full of, it just happens, right? Because you don't have the fear. And as you get older, some of those things, I think some people allow, the older they get, the more they allow the doors to lock.
Yeah.
And the more things that are happening in life, whether they own a house or they have kids or they, get married, right? And each one of those things they can allow to lock a door versus constantly allowing every domino to be unlocked. And so for me, that's a little bit how I think, but how did you think through, all of those things?
Well, at first it was more of a matter of just experimentation. I didn't know that it was going to catapult me into real estate. Like at first I really didn't think of myself as like, I'm a real estate guy. Like it took me forever to be able to adopt that title. But I mean, it wasn't all just like cookies and rainbows. Like a door would be open and then all of a sudden there was somebody right there to kick me in the balls. Like, here, welcome to the next level, right? Like, here you go. Like, there's something about doing this. This is what I tell people about real estate. Like, if it were easy, everybody would do it. And I don't mean that in the sense of like, if it were easy, it's more like, nah, dude, like it is a people intense business where one person can mess up the entire train of operations of what you're doing. And it really took me a long time to be able to assess that. And I agree with what you're saying, right? I took all the risks. I took all the risks because I had nothing to lose. Now I live in this place. I have a better car. Now I'm married and I've got responsibility. I've got employees who I need to provide for. So am I more risk averse? You have to learn that a little bit less. I'm not like, I can't take that risk. I think about it more. I calculate it more. I run it past my employees. I run it past my wife. I think about how it plays out a little bit more versus being like, oh yeah, here you go. Let's go and do that. Because that's where Yeah, that's how I got to where I was being. But when I started managing other people's money and utilizing other people's money, I learned very quickly that I can't make those decisions because if I'm
There's
following,
a whole new set of kicking the balls with
see what I'm saying?
managing and running people's money. Because one of the hardest things I had to learn about managing people's money, just because you make them money doesn't mean they're happy. And that was a really difficult one for me to learn. I'm like, I made you money. I made you good money. I made you a ridiculous return, but you're still unhappy, right? And that was something I had to just kind of accept that is the mentality of an investor,
Yeah.
right? And learn that part of it. And like when he's talking about being kicked in the balls, just think of this a little bit, everybody. A rehabber or a contractor who walks away with your money. A rehabber or a contractor who says for weeks or months they're going to get stuff done and then it never gets done. So the project carries on. A person in a county or a city who's supposed to give you permits who never responds to an email, phone call, or a text.
Yeah.
A lawyer, who sues you out of nowhere for something that has nothing to do with you or your company, but you still got to defend it. You still have to make it go away, right? And so that's just, some of the kick in the balls I'm sure you've run into over the years, or you're trying to get loans and suddenly some idiot, that you were trying to, weigh out loan options with on a different loan, suddenly your credit pull is pulled 17 times in 24 hours, and that freaks everybody out, and on top of that puts a dent in your credit score. Those are some of the kicks in the balls he's talking about, over the years, so that you can kind of start to be aware of, these are things all of you who want to be investors are going to run into. It's just the choices that you make when you run into them and the things that you decide to do. So, for you now, there's more at risk, right? For me now, like, 40 to 50 employees. So when I decided to go take a risk, we in October, we had to, buy a $1.5 million farm. Our financing fell through like 2 days before we were supposed to close. And because one of our internal loan people made a mistake. And so I had to raise that money very fast, and we did. And at the same time, like I decided to take the risk to go after it and attack it. But there's a lot more calculated with that risk than 12 years ago when I didn't want to be a real estate person, and real estate person just kept pulling me back in. Like earlier you said, like, now I know I'm a real estate guy, and I know that too. I know I'm a real estate guy, right? I'm a really good real estate, but at the same time, like for a long time, I just kept trying to get away from real estate. Like in some ways, I just didn't want to do real estate. God or the universe or whatever you want to call it kept pulling me back in until I just surrendered and said, I'm gonna blow this up. I'm gonna blow this shit up. I'm gonna blow this real estate thing up because that's what I'm gonna do. But I had to accept that first for me. So
Yeah.
I don't know for you. When
Otherwise,
did you own that?
I mean, it wasn't a matter of like, I had to own it when I got invited to do like my first podcast. And then immediately after my first podcast, I got invited to go speak at Hawaii. And I was like, I guess I'm a real estate guy. Like, okay, sure. And again, I'm 26, so I'm young. I really had to learn real quick that I was not hot shit coming out the gate. Sure, I knew what I was talking about, but because I knew what I was talking about, I was trying to pitch it to people who were like, I would never invest that in my own backyard. And my immediate reaction to them was, okay, you're an idiot. And let me tell you why you're an idiot. And I really had to like walk back a lot of my own hubris of that. And that was what I really wanted to avoid. It was like, I'm this real estate hotshot. And when I like really came to terms with it was, I'm in Hawaii, I'm talking about it. And I had to shift my thought process from, okay, I'm going to talk down to these people to I'm going to educate these people. And that's when I really was like, okay, I'm not only the real estate guy, I'm the tertiary market expert. Why am I an expert? Because I can show you that I've made money in tertiary markets. I can prove and write you a strategy on how you can make money in tertiary markets. And I myself invest in these tertiary markets while also utilizing other people's capital to do so. And we make a solid return. Going back to your point, is everybody happy? Of course not. That's not my job. My job is not to make you happy. You know whose job it is to make you happy? My investor relations person. That's her entire goal, right? I just make you the good money. And any complaints you have, you can file them over to her. But with that being the case, it was a matter of, okay, I had to really learn that lesson of like, oh man, like they're not happy and I'm making them all this money. And I was always in fear of like, they're going to sue me. Like, I'm going to get sued. I don't want to get sued. And then I realized, okay, well, let me set everything up the right way to make sure that I can focus on being the tertiary markets guy and let my team be the real estate portion of what I do. And that made my job a lot easier. As it grew, as I started earning more and building out this goal of mine, my team became the experts that they were experts in things that I wasn't experts in. For example, construction, right? I hate it, my least favorite thing. But somebody's got to do it. And it was a matter of, I can pay this contractor hundreds of thousands of dollars a job and have a diminished return, or bring somebody on who knows what they're doing and then ship out the work and get the work done. So that's when I kind of realized, from there, it kind of turned into, I'm no longer a real estate guy. I'm more of just I'm a business builder. Like, I can build a company, I can build a business, put people in place and go do what I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you listening who've never built a business before, you'll learn once you do it once, it's pretty easy to do it again. Not going to say you're going to have the same results every single time, but you're going to learn a lot of lessons on what works, what doesn't work, and why it can be applied to whatever it is you're trying to do.
As I kind of comb through, right, the things that you're saying there, right? Because I like to dive into things that I find like fascinating or interesting for people, right? One thing, just tell people what a tertiary market is, because I'm a real estate guy and I wasn't super familiar, and I asked you that at the beginning. So but for the layman who's watching, just tell them a little bit what that is.
Yeah, so a tertiary market, in the sense of investment real estate or just real estate itself, is an economy or market group that thrives off of itself without having the need to produce for another group of markets. So your primary markets, right, your big cities, they rely on secondary markets to provide them what they need, which are, in their case, right, their farmlands and the places that rely on one company buying something from another company in a different market. That's the primary market exchange, is what you call that.
It's like when Amazon goes into New York City, or did it go into DC? It went into DC and New York City, right?
Yeah.
So then the cities around that suddenly become tertiary markets because they're providing support to such a big company entering into a city. Is that somewhat of what you're saying?
Kind of it. I think more of the sense that becomes a secondary market because they're relying on all of their shipments going to one spot, mm-hmm. right? Which would be New York or DC. They're relying on those shipments to go to one area to take care of that area, while also being able to take care of the secondary market, which thus kind of becomes that suburb. So really looking at it, a primary market is a market that relies on other markets to survive. A secondary market provides for primary markets. Your tertiary markets survive by themselves. And so what I've been able to do is, because there's a military base in this tertiary market, it survives.
They have their own income producer.
Exactly. And it stays within their community. Well, what that means is things are not really the best in those markets, right? It means that properties are out of date, businesses are out of date, infrastructure is out of date.
Like Cuba,
right? Cuba's the perfect.
If you've been there, yeah.
Yeah. And the reason why is because it has to rely on itself, and not necessarily itself, but it relies on outside tourism to be able to thrive, but it keeps that self-sustained within its own. Cuba then doesn't go to, Florida and say, hey, give us an order of key lime pies. No, they make their own key lime pies. Although they may be Cuban key lime pies, they're very different, right? And so with the tertiary markets, it allows itself to really just grow, and you can really find and source things that other investors aren't willing to do. So for example, you're going to have to raise the price of housing if you go and invest in this market, if you really want to start flipping homes. How do you do that? Well, you have to find cheap homes, fix them up for cheap, and come up with creative solutions to be able to make that happen. And that's just some of the different concepts that really focus within how people don't see real estate. Most people see it like this, right? Like, I'm in my own backyard, I'm a real estate investor. It's like walking around your backyard with a shovel thinking you're going to go find a dinosaur. I mean, the chances of you finding a dinosaur are pretty slim, but I guarantee you, if you just walk someplace else, you probably are going to find what you're looking for.
I would think in military communities, right? The awareness on how to home buy, right? The awareness on, like that they can buy, right? I think would be a big part of raising home prices as well, because if you just create buyers, that's going to raise valuation, right? And if you start taking crappy houses, you start rehabbing, doing added value real estate, right? But if you create an increased number of buyers, I think it makes a huge difference. So I would assume having, buyer education, right, for the military professionals that are military members that are in those communities would be huge. Because I think a lot of military people I've known over the years that, like, they don't know the power of that they have to buy. They don't understand that even when they do go into a city and 2 years later they're going to be in a new city, they should buy in that first city. And when they leave, they should rent that property and keep it, for long-term wealth and long-term, growth finances. And then when they go into a new city, they should buy another property. right?
So that's the thing is like a lot of people, that's where we were talking about that those blinders in the
Yeah.
military, you're kind of taught to do things one way, which is you move, you use your VA loan, you buy the house, and then you sell the house to somebody else who uses their VA loan, and then you buy the other home with your VA loan.
Well, that's
No,
the other thing. Yeah, VA loans are like 1% down, right?
it goes
It's
0%
really
down in most cases,
0%. Yeah.
which is even better because most of the stuff you can really do with that home allows you to really kind of do what you need to do. Now there are certain thresholds you have to stay in within the market to make sure that it's affordable. I think that's where a lot of people have a hard time. But with that being the case, refinancing isn't taught well in the military community. Why? Because if you're in a tertiary market, you're relying on local banks. There's no Chase Bank, there's no Bank of America, there's no Wells Fargo. You are relying on local banks to care enough about this property, about this person, to be able to send it to their underwriting to get it done. But here's
Have
the
you
thing:
done this in any foreign countries at all, or only in the U.S.?
only in the United States for now. I think eventually we'll try to go
I mean, I
some.
just think that'd be a fun adventure, right? To do it. I mean, not so much that it might not make any more money than it would here. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it just seems like a fun adventure to do it in a foreign country, right?
I think you'd have a lot more fun there. I think purely because if I'm thinking like foreign country like the Philippines, not a lot of zoning rules and restrictions in the Philippines, which means not to say I can build whatever I want, but for the most part, I can build things that are a little outside of the box with like,
I might avoid the countries where Americans have been kidnapped, but maybe not. Maybe not.
that's fine.
Just
You don't have to worry
just
about
kidding.
that. We're not worried about that. That's the
As long
that's
as
the
we
best
can,
side.
as long as we can get Manny Pacquiao to support us, we'll be all right.
There we go. He'll be the face of the building. We'll just have a mural of him right there.
I will say one of the funnest, most wild adventures days with my wife in my life was in the Philippines. So we started with a drive into the country where we went the giant whales. I'm trying to think of what their name is, where you can feed them. I think uh like they have the huge mouths and you can feed them as people. Whale sharks.
Oh, sorry.
Whale sharks. So we went swimming with whale sharks, right? And I'm talking like this is like Philippines swimming with whale sharks. So you're not like in cages or something. You're like you have fins and goggles and a snorkel, right? And they hand you a bunch of food, and you're just out there swimming with whale sharks, right? Just in the middle of the water. And there's big ones and there's smaller ones, right? And the water probably goes down 20 feet, and there's boats, right? And they'll come up and they're curious and they'll bump into you, right? But they're not, so that was, really, really weird. And then like just a lot of fun, right? And then later in the day, we're driving back and I see like a little small stadium and I'm like, wow, like this is kind of interesting. It seemed kind of ruckus, right? And maybe, 3,000, 4,000 people, And so my brother-in-law was with my wife and I, and we're like, we got to go see what's going on. Like we have to go. We just have to go. Completely random experience. And it was actually cockfighting, right? It was rooster fighting. And I was blown away by the emotions the owners of the individual roosters had for their roosters. Like there were guys just, crying, and there was guys, like giving like mental like pep talks to the roosters before they went in. And lots of times they go in and fight just like a UFC fighter, right? And they're not walking out dead. You know what I mean? Like I'm sure that happens a lot. We didn't stay for 40 fights, right? We stayed for like 2. But at the same time, in both the fights we saw, it's just interesting to see the dynamic of like, Freddie Roach as a rooster, trainer anyways. So that was one of those more fascinating days that I've ever had. And the end of the day, it ended up being like at a restaurant on a beach overseeing the ocean that cost like $11, to feed 4 people, and pretty cool day. So
goodness, I cannot.
Cool day.
And that brings me to my next point here. I guess the biggest thing some people may want to be paying attention for, inflation for sure. Especially after our whole COVID-19 debacle. I don't know. I mean, how are you guys looking, or I guess preparing for some of that stuff as we kind of go through for like, not this year, but definitely kind of into the next 3-4 years?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people think there's a real estate crash coming, right? And I don't. And so I'm a little bit different in how I see it. I think that the banks learned a little bit from '08, and I think the government learned a little bit from '08, and I think they'll drag the foreclosures out as long as humanly possible. They did a shadow inventory last time. They're going to do a shadow inventory this time. I actually think some of the moratoriums they're going to carry out all the way till 2022, both eviction and foreclosure. Because just because COVID ends doesn't mean people are suddenly financially sound, right? So, but at the same time, I think that the banks want that. They don't want to see a real estate market drop. They don't want to see a price drop. They don't want to see a valuation drop, because then that messes up their notes, that messes up their trading. It messes up a whole bunch of different things, right? And the more they lend for, the more money they make. So banks only want to see housing prices skyrocket. Like if if all $300,000 homes in America were suddenly worth 3 million, the banks would be really, really freaking happy, because they'd be lending against all that money, right? Obviously, incomes and different things would change. I mean, I do think inflation's coming, and I don't know if it's just purely because of COVID, but I think we're in the acceleration phase of like, I think 100 years from now, like they're going to look back at our society and they're going to talk about the acceleration model. They're going
Yeah.
to talk about how technology accelerated so rapidly, so fast compared to anything we ever expected. They're going to talk about how economies went up and down. And I think they're also going to be talking about 100 years from now, governments that are going up and failing, and governments that are falling, and governments that are, and we haven't seen that yet, but I think it's coming. I think there's going to be, because when money starts to get crazy out of hand, governments succeed and governments fail.
Yeah.
You look at 1,000 years in our world, and there's not a government that's made it. There's not a single government that I know of that's made it 1,000 years in the world.
Yeah.
And so now you look at 200 years. How many governments have actually made it 200 years? Not that many. You know, America is one of the longest running, continuous governments in the history of our world. So now you start to look at that and you start to wonder, like, what's potentially out there. And so I do think inflation's coming, but I also think COVID's just one of many, many factors. I think it was coming anyways.
Yeah.
And I think it's coming because the powers that be want it to come. I think they want money to grow. They want it to accelerate. The more money that's at play, the bigger the game that's being played, the more they can capture. You look at, I mean, there's weird stuff, right? I have conspiracy theories, right? I wonder why the two richest men in the world are both Americans and they both are building their own space programs, right? I think, I wonder why, one of them's building tunnels out of Los Angeles into the desert, like there's, I have other kinds. How about you? I mean, do you do conspiracy theory at all, or? I think it's fun. So
I'm even writing a screenplay on my conspiracy. That's how real I think it is. So mine doesn't happen to do with, I guess, like America, but more of like, what happened to the Romans when I think about it, right? All of a sudden, booming civilization, and then overnight something happened. My thought process was, this is gonna sound super crazy, but hey, I'm being honest. I think that at some point they got so civilized and so advanced where they were on the verge of experiencing electricity. And I guess in the movie screenplay that I'm writing about this, aliens come and basically just wipe out everybody. Don't know how, don't know what happens. Aliens come, wipe out everybody. In the movie that I'm like creating, Channing Tatum plays like one of these super cool Roman dudes. He's huge. And I'm basically just gonna make, I don't know if you saw the movie Cowboys versus Alien with Lee.
I did.
Yeah, so
I've at least seen enough of it where I know what the movie's about.
Fair enough. So yeah, Romans versus aliens. But definitely, I think, there's been some shifts back on purpose, purely because everybody was starting to get to where they need to go. And now I think that this shift happening now is like, it's weird. My biggest conspiracy that I truly believe in happened was after 2008, when the banks and the government were like, all right, you blew the whistle. Screw you, middle America. Like, goodbye forever. That's why you're seeing all these cities grow so fast and all these homes skyrocket in pricing, because everybody's kind of doing everything for the rich at the moment. No one's really doing a lot for lower income, middle class individuals because, yeah, sucks to suck. They don't get accepted for credit cards as much. They don't get accepted for cars as much. They don't, like, there's a lot more. They don't have as much of the debt.
Well, they're not a part of the machine.
Exactamundo, right? Because like they're not contributing in the way.
I mean, compared, but like philosophically, right? Do you really think that like people that are like Bezos or Musk or Gates, right? I'm just talking about the ridiculous. By the way, to add to my first two guys having their own space programs, Gates is buying more land than anybody else on the entire planet in the middle of nowhere. Just throwing that out there. So the the other thing I was thinking about is like, do those guys even think of middle class America as middle class America, right? I think they think of like there's people that are below the machine that produces income, and then people that are a part of the machine that produces income for them, right? And so like I think they see that, like I think they see things in groups and classes. And I think part of their thing is they want to take as much as they can by making that education more accessible and different things. They want people that aren't a part of the machine to be a part of the machine, because that's really their goal, is to have everybody a part of their Brave New World machine, right? If you've ever read Brave New World or know what I'm talking about when it comes to that kind of,
Yeah,
I
no.
think that's kind of part of where society financially is headed when it comes to the world, because the uber rich don't want to give it up. And there might be a revolution against the uber rich because people get frustrated, but people will never be so frustrated if they have wealth in their minds,
Exactly.
right?
Right. Like what
Right.
is perceived of them as
What is
wealth.
perceived wealth, right? Because for me, like it wasn't, I wouldn't have said to myself that like when I first achieved, compared to my childhood, which was growing up, both my parents were dead by the time I was 20. They were addicts, I would never have said that the wealth that I had today was wealth, right? I would have said, well, when I own a house, when I have a consistent income, when I'm taking care of my kids and I can help them go to college and different things, I would have said that was wealth, right? Well, I achieved that, around your age, right? In my mid 20s. So then it was kind of like, well, what is actual wealth? What does that actually mean, right? For me, a long time ago, it came stopped being about what can I buy, what can I do, what can I achieve. It became, what can I build, what can I create, right? And so then I think then there's a next phase of monetary finances, is when you step out of the machine wealth, where you're, because my wealth doesn't really need to contribute to the day-to-day machine anymore, right? Because there's nothing I'm going to buy that's going to really impact anything at this point, because my life is, my finances buy me the things that I need to buy, so that part's taken care of. So any more wealth I build is for really investment at this point, right? um I mean, someday maybe I want to buy a bigger house, or more expensive car, but why? It's
Yeah.
no need for it, right? It's pointless. So for me, then it becomes, what do I build? And so now you become a builder, and so now you start to enter into a new phase, right? When it comes to, so sometimes how those people think about us, or how the World Bank thinks about, middle class America, I think maybe different, a little bit different than how we think about it.
Oh, for sure. So I grew up super poor myself, and it was just like, weird. Like I didn't really know what the other option was. I knew what I saw around me, which was black people in really nice cars dealing drugs. And to me, that didn't seem good because most people were dead by 25, 30. So for me, it was like, I don't really know what the other option was. When I got adopted, I got adopted by people who had means, lots of them. And it showed me, oh, wow, there's so much more here. And I
How
used
old
to
were
think
you when you got adopted?
like 11, like, yeah, I was 11.
Wow. My
So
partner Amy adopted her son when he was 9. I adopted my son when he was born, but she adopted him when he was 9. So it's a different kind of adoption when you adopt
I'm telling you,
a grown child, is the way I put it. Yeah.
being able to see the world and kind of understand, being very aware of how things work. I had that and was like, okay, interesting. So you mean to tell me that none of what, like, I thought that was my reality. I thought that's what I was doomed to be. I used to think that being black was like, okay, black equals being doomed. That is just what I see every day in my lifetime. Then when I got to the other side, I was able to meet, people of means, and most of them happened to be white and very wealthy. And it was like, okay, interesting. So this is where all the wealth is. And then it wasn't until I met, an African American who was beyond wealthy. And I was like, what the hell do you do? The dude's like, well, I designed a system for microwaves to so on and so forth. And I lost track. But basically, the man designed the little trays, the little circular plastic wheel things in the microwave. And I was like, wow. So you built something, and that's how you did it. That's what I wanted to. That's what I always needed to hear was I could build something. So from there, I strive to like build everything. Yeah, and because I was young when I sold my first company, I spent my money on dumb things, stupid things. I learned my lesson. As I got older and more mature, I just realized I can't buy any of the things I wanted to buy. But there was one point where I'm talking to my friends, and they're all 20 something year olds, and talking to them, and they're like, well, I can't just go and spend $1,000 on a vacation. I kind of look over and I'm like, you can't do what? And it wasn't meant to be like hurtful. It was just like, oh man, really? And that kind of really brought me back to when my mom told me we can't spend $30 on the groceries that we need. We can't spend $15 on the groceries we need. And it really showed me, and it brought me right back to where I'd come from. And I decided from that standpoint, I will do my best not to invest any of my money in primary markets. I live in an area that was built for the rich. I mean, like that's Dallas in a nutshell. That is very much it. But
It's
just
a
outside,
playground of influence.
yeah, right. It was just like, I was able to kind of see it, and I was high up on the playground. I was on the slide until someone kicked my ass off, and I got back down. I was like, okay, yeah. So then I told myself, I'm not going to place any of my investors' money or my money in any primary markets because that's where everything else is. If they want to go take their return and go buy something nice and shiny, by all means, go and do it. But I'm going to focus on providing equity to the people who need it, because when people buy up all these homes and fix them and flip them, no one really thinks, again, most people think like this, right, with their blinders on. When you take those off, you see that every time you flip a $300,000 home, which is way too expensive anyways, for $2.6 million, you're making it substantially harder for the other 8 people down the road who are living paycheck to paycheck. They're going to be forced to leave, and no one's building anything for them because the middle class has been looked down upon, and no one's really, everybody thinks they're fighting for the middle class, but quite honestly, most people are fighting for what they see in the cities. Oh, the inner cities and injustice. That same exact stuff happens literally 2.5 hours outside of any big city. Yet it's completely disregarded because it's not happening right in front of people. And that's just one of the things that I think, most people have a hard time seeing. Yeah, like middle class is oftentimes disregarded. No one really knows and or cares because they aren't prevalent in everyday society. That's really what it comes down to for a lot of people, I think.
So you're talking about, growing up, and you're talking about, what you see and what you don't see, right? And, I think it's fascinating as you grow up as a kid. Like I moved from a very, very wealthy parents who actually owned a racetrack in Amarillo, Texas called Umbarger Park. And
Right.
it's outside of Amarillo. It's in one of the suburbs there. And they lost it for all kinds of different reasons. And over the years, we would be middle class, and then we'd be dirt poor, and then we'd be middle class, and then we'd be owning apartments, and then we'd be extremely dirt poor again because of, when you have somebody like my father had the ability to build income and build wealth, but then he had addictions that constantly figure out a way to take it away from him, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the roller coaster I grew up with as a kid. And so I would see different communities, right? Different ways of living, different, I could go in one area where, being black would have been, you'd have been an outlier, right? You'd have been the oddball in the community, which is probably what you went through, right? Once you were adopted, being in the influential community you're in, maybe not, depending on what circle your adopted parents ran in. But then in the very next community, the next school I would live in, the next city, and being a white kid, I was, the outlier, right? And so they kind of like I got to see those different dynamics and start to create a little bit of an understanding of those dynamics, right? And but very early on, somewhere I saw that like people are like a lot of their views, a lot of their thoughts on other people or other cultures is based on, where they were, how they were raised, where they were brought up. And so when you talk about money, have you ever heard of the money couple? They have a money personality test. Have you ever heard it? It's
No.
it's really cool. Like it's if you've heard of the 5 love languages before.
Yes, I have. Okay.
So it's kind of like the 5 love languages for money, where you have a money personality type, right? And so my money personality types is, a flyer risk taker, right? I'm sure your risk taker is one of yours for sure. Um, and so I find that fascinating as you grew up and you went from one to the other, right? Being in those different cultures, I think probably created some of that understanding in a subconscious, in a non-conscious way, right? Of there is a difference, right? There is a difference between wealth and non-wealth. There is and once you see the other side, you realize that the other side really isn't better, right? It's just different. And
Yeah.
and that's a fascinating concept to me, right? Whereas like where I was, in a very, white suburban, schooling, right? And then I was in a very inner city, rougher school, right? But I could see the two sides, and I'm like, there's really like these are the same people, right?
Yeah.
But their experiences are completely different, and how they view the other side because they've never experienced the other side, right? And I know it's not the most PC, I don't know how, in the world we live in, right? I experienced a lot of reverse racism, right? And that was tough for me as a kid to experience that, because I didn't know what the other side was like, right? And so to experience, getting jumped, right? Or experience just not being liked, for who I was and stuff, right? It was difficult because where grew up, you got into a fight and there was a fairness of a fight, and then people cleaned it up because everybody. I grew up in the city in Iowa, so I grew up in Des Moines, and so wrestling is like like basketball in Indiana or football in Texas or baseball in California, depending on what cities you do.
Sure.
And so like there was like people would break it up, and there were rules and other things. And then I went to a new school, and there was no rules, right? A fight was a fight, and like if you could walk away, great. If you can't walk away, then you should have fought better, right? Like it was a different, very different kind of fairness, right? So it just different experiences. But I think seeing those dual dynamics throughout my upbringing is, I see that in you, where you saw the one side where you saw toughness, you saw hustle, you saw like a different, very different kind of grit, and then you suddenly were a part of wealthier communities and area, and there's a hustle, and there's a different type of grit, and there's a different type, but it's still the same type of ingenuity or the same type of mentality, but completely put into different direction.
I had to learn that, which was the hard part. And I think because I was so naive to it all, I just asked somebody. I was like, "Hey man, how did you do that?" Guy pulled up in a very nice car, and beautiful wife, and I was like, "What the hell?" And I said it like, "How'd you do that?" And he stopped and he walked back from the other side of his car, and he took the time and he said, "I asked everybody the same question. What made you work so hard? Why do you have what you have? And how do I get it?" So I took that with me through life. I got, not to say, I went to boarding school as once I got brought into this new family. And I went to school with kids who were far wealthier than I ever could have possibly been. We're talking princes, we're talking the kids whose parents, owned companies like Samsung. Like it was a different class of wealth where they could literally ask for anything and get it. So, one of my favorite trips I ever took was I got asked to go to South Korea. And, I was like, all right, cool, sure, South Korea, fantastic. And we get off of this private jet and get in this Rolls Royce and get picked up on this private airfield. It was beautiful, it was amazing. Get taken to this beautiful, gigantic hotel. I mean, I'm talking, and I'm like 16. So
Man, I can totally see like trolls out there being like, "Oh, so like everything was handed to him, and like
no,
raising money was really easy for him." I'm just,
also, no,
I might as well say it because some trolls are typing it. So
all right, let them type away. And so with that being the case, I see the old man who's paid for everything, and I'm like, "Hey man, like," I asked him those 3 questions, and he told me, and I was like, "All right, cool, I'm gonna do that." His 3 answers were very much right. How did you do this? He's like, "I worked hard, and I didn't bring my head up from doing what I was doing for like 50 years." He's like, "All of this is brand new. What you're seeing is 50 years of hard work, of me not taking a single paycheck, of me scraping, pinching. Like I'm able to offer my grandkids, because that's who I was hanging out with her his grandkids. He's like, my own kids didn't even have this. My grandkids have this now." And I said, all right, interesting. So it's not instant. That was the first lesson I learned, right? And the second lesson was, I became an expert in what I do. I am one of the only people on earth that can do what I do. And I'm like, all right, be the expert, know what you're doing, become the subject matter expert. I say, be the SME, right? Be the one everybody has to talk to in order to go and get places. That's what I did when I figured out how the tertiary markets worked. And then told me something I never forget. He's like, don't spend all your time chasing women. I was like, all right, fantastic. I chased one woman, got her, and I focused my entire energy on one thing. And that was sort of it. Was like, I would ask all of my friends' parents, anybody who I saw had something that I wanted, whether it was a good marriage, whether it was, a good vacation house, a good car, whatever they had that I saw and could admire. I asked them, how'd you get that? Like, I want that.
in my family, we have a running joke like, meet a good woman, marry her, have a really good life. Don't meet a good woman, don't marry her, end up in jail. So it's like a joke we tell all of our men as they're growing up, just to get them into that place where they're not chasing, tail their whole life and stuff. So
I'm telling you, and that was just one thing. Like I said, when I sold my first company, I went broke very quickly because it was like, yeah,
spending on the wrong stuff. Have you ever heard the George Bush, the Barbara Bush joke about the gas station?
No.
So like George and Barbara Bush were like, pulled up to a gas station and they're, in their limousine, but they had to get gas, right? And George Bush sees the guy working behind the counter and he says, "Barbara, didn't you used to date that guy in high school?" And she's like, "Yeah, I did. I guess Allen could have been president too."
No, I love that.
I don't know how much truth in that, but it's good joke. So
That's a good joke. No, I like that. It's very much like the Winston Churchill joke. I love that. It's
I haven't
literally
heard that one.
it's so same one. Winston Churchill, his wife, and Winston goes and talks to all these people, and the sweeper, street sweeper, right? He spends all of his time speaking with Mrs. Churchill, Winston Churchill's wife, and he's like, hey, that guy was really admired by you, like, what'd you talk about? And he's like, oh, that he's just, followed everything I've done. Like he's basically in love with me. And he's like, oh, well, it's a good thing you didn't marry the street sweeper. You'd be the wife of the street sweeper. And she straight up says to him, no, I think I'd still be the wife of the prime minister. And then I was like, all right, dope. All right, fantastic. But that's just one of the things. I mean, you ask those questions. If you have a question, you don't know something, I don't really know.
I think there's a lot of hate in unintentional to people without wealth of people with wealth, right? Or a lot of jealousy,
I think jealousy is it. I don't think you could hate somebody for it.
Somebody you don't know, but I mean, I know like where I grew up as a kid, right? Like you wouldn't, people didn't drive a Mercedes, people didn't drive a Beamer, people didn't drive. And if they did, maybe you thought they were a drug dealer, right? And that's, where I grew up. But then, over the years, I started to think of like, what'd they do right? And that was something I started to say to myself, like, what'd they do right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to figure out how they did it, what they do. And it was more of a unlocking the process, unlocking the machine, right? That they, how they do it, how they get there. And I think that even started for me as a kid, having a baseball background. I watched another kid who threw harder than me. I wanted to see how they threw harder than me. Hit the ball further. I wanted to see how they hit the ball further, right? And I like even now I chase in the sense that like I want to see like when I look at funds that are bigger than mine, right? I explore what they do. I want to learn from what they do. I want to understand how they got there, right? And there's things, like when I started my first fund in 2014, so 7 years ago. And, over the years, there's been a constant learning, right? And some of the things I've had to learn is, legal. Some of the things I've had to learn is financial reporting. Some things I've had to learn, that I wouldn't have understood before. But then now I start to learn, fundraising and capital raising in a much bigger way, right? For me, fundraising in the beginning was, let's create a group of people interested in an investment, right? And let's, solicit their interest in the investment, right? And that worked well. It's kind of part of growing. But now, I look at publishers and I look at platforms and I look at, other things, and I'm looking at like, how do we get our company in a position where they seek us? And they want us, to be, they want to bring us investors. So how do others bring investors? And so you start to level the different pieces up as you go through it. And so there's different, like, and I'm a big UFC fan. I don't know if you are, but I hear Cormier or Rogan all the time. They're like, there's levels to this game, right? And I'm like, I feel like, old Mario Brothers video game, like what's the next level? How do I go through the green cylinder, right? To get to the next level. And sometimes the challenging part is when to say no, right? Because there's plenty of levels that you don't want to be a part of.
Agreed.
And that starts to become to me as well just as important is like what's the no, because I say yes to a lot and I want to say yes to a lot, right? There's that crazy parent movie out right now, Yes Day for kids. Pretty funny. But you've got to, there's things in life you have to say no to, right? If their kids wanted to eat battery acid that day, obviously they were going to say no. So
I'm like, no, sorry. But that's the biggest thing is, every year I keep finding myself, trust me, you do this a lot. But as soon as you find this up portion, it's more about, like, okay, we hit our goal for the year. How do we accelerate and do more? Is it going to take on a risk? Of course, but calculate it, understand it, make the decision and move. And that's why, for me, like, I want to start my own REIT. That's definitely a big thing. So, who do I look up to for that? Well, you're one of the people, because I can actually reach out to you, connect with you and say, hey, listen, Dutch, I have no clue what I'm doing. How do I do this? And I'm going to be the person who asks. You're going to get an email from me that says, how do I start my own REIT? That'll be the subject. Why? Because that's what I'm trying to learn. And with that, I think that's one of the other greatest things about real estate is that if you build your group of people the right way and they support you, they're not going to see you as a competitor. They're going to see you as, all right, somebody who we could possibly, merge forces with, or somebody who I can see as somebody to.
I just think if I could help you become a REIT and then you could become way bigger than me, then you could just buy me out.
That's the plan.
And then I don't even have to find a buyer someday. So
that's the plan. Anyway. So I'll be years behind you, but as soon as you're ready to retire, man, you let me know and I'm coming in. I'll have somebody right behind me doing the same thing.
I'll tell you, one of the hardest things in the beginning was just finding the professionals, right? I went through CPA firms after CPA firms after CPA firms for doing the accounting, the financial reporting, and different things. And like, you'd find this firm and they were great, and there'd be an owner, and like they'd engage with you, and then they'd hand you off to the, accountant that just graduated college to handle your books. And, investors' books are incredibly important to them. It doesn't matter that they made money, they want reporting, right? So making them happy is a part of reporting, right? Just having clean, crisp, on time, official reporting was incredibly important. And so that was one of the things before we came a REIT, when we were just running our initial funds, that we had to get figured out. And then lawyers, I've been through 4 different phases of lawyers over the years to get to the firms that I work with now, and they'll take your money. They'll tell you if they've done it before, but they've never done it before. It's kind of like the contractor who says, he's, replaced electric in a house, but he's only ever been an AC guy his entire career. So, it's interesting. It's interesting how many parallels there are as you enter into the different phases.
You learn it regardless. That's the benefit of it all. It doesn't matter. You're going to have to learn it. If you don't learn it, so it separates you from the people who can, the people who can't. And I've been with a lot of the people who can't. And honestly, it's been very interesting. The conversation's extremely different, right? There is a lot of jealousy, a lot of, I'm not gonna say hatred, but just, upsetness because, oh man, well, if I had the time, and like, you had the time, you were right there and you quit. And a lot of people don't realize that when you're right here, like, this is the hardest part, but getting from here to here, relatively simple once you've learned that lesson and been down there. It sucks. It's not comfortable. It's not fun, but man, the best things in life come from really hard work and really shitty days.
One of the ones I used to get all the time was, do you have kids? And I'd be like, no, I don't have kids. And they'd be like, there, that's why you're successful. That's why you're able to achieve. That's why you're able to make it, because, without kids, you have so much more time and different things. So now I actually love when people ask me that question. Yeah, I got 2 5-year-olds. I got two kids. I got that one checked off. You can't use that one as an excuse.
I get that one all the time. They're like, well, of course you're doing so well. You don't have any distractions. Like, oh, I mean, I do, but yeah, sure. Right. Like, they always want to put you in like this little box of, well, he doesn't have kids, so people who don't have kids are super successful. And again, that was one of the questions I'd ask people. Like, listen, man, you got like 12 kids all in boarding school. Like, how are you doing this? He's like, I just did it. I planned and I saved and I scrimped and I pinched. And I was like, all right, that's good advice, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to make more than enough.
I say 2 kids that are homeschooled, though, is much harder than 12 kids at boarding school.
I can imagine. That's the benefit of boarding school. That's why I liked it. It's like Harry Potter, except in real life. It's fantastic.
All right, brother, we made it an hour. It was flowed. It was good. You did great, man. We'll get awesome clips out of that, man. It was great. Appreciate you.
I'm glad the conversation went the way it did.
It was flowed.